Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
It's episode 44 of Quarantime, and we have moved through many months of pandemic, and now as we start to go to the other side in this very different world, we're confronting today kind of that master question: what is reality? Now we came up with this because, if you look at the political scene, people are talking about the fact that you are entitled to facts, but not your own reality. But in fact, we may be living in a world where there are more ways of looking at what's real than might seem obvious. And today on this show, we're going to spend some time with two artists that are going to help us unpack that, who we'll meet in a moment. Claudia Hart, who has been working in simulated reality. So think of the kind of form of gaming where you get to create your own world for many years. And she observes that if photography comes from a tradition of materiality, you take a picture and it's real, perhaps these simulated worlds come from not that. And as we start living in worlds where we manufacture reality, in fact, we may be moving away from that clockwork universe, that enlightenment universe, towards something that is more what we make. And then we're going to meet with artist Amy Carl, who takes this even further and synthesizes reality from biological material, pushes the limits of evolutionary biology and simulation. So today we get into that. And now let's, by the way, I'm so excited about this because I think this is a great example of how the artistic world helps us understand the world we're in, which is changing rapidly. And no one is better at helping us do that than our co-host, Mickey. Hey, Mick.
Hey, Peter. I'm excited about this topic, just what is reality? I think I started thinking about what is reality probably in a naive way when Stephen Colbert talked about truthiness. And he actually asked everybody to do a concerted effort to change a Wikipedia entry to actually change the truth about something a long time back when he had a TV show. But if you think of it, what is reality is being challenged in many ways with things like deep fake, where people are able to put my face on Leonardo DiCaprio's body and be in a movie and things like that. And I think the other part that we're starting to see is this notion that there's some work going on in ETH Zurich and in other places where they're doing embodied cognition, where people are inside of a virtual reality thing and they can push a button and bring their body right out in front of themselves. And then they take a feather and they comb it across your back for real. And they take a virtual feather and comb it across your back on the person that's standing in front of you, that's you. And over the course of a few minutes, you start believing your body is in front of you. And they're actually using this to help people that have fear of heights kind of walk out to the edge of a virtual cliff and then take their body and walk it out a little further and then put it back in for the thrill and then pull it back out. And they're actually able to help people reduce their fear of heights or other things through this embodiment where they're actually shifting the body. And so it's sort of a body-computer interface instead of a brain-computer interface. So it's really fascinating to see how our brains are pretty malleable about what reality is. And both of these artists are doing some amazing work here and challenging us to think about what is reality and how will we entangle reality with our own consciousness.
Hey, as we jump into today's show, let's bring both of our guests on, and then we'll go in deep with Claudia. So let's bring Claudia and Amy on and say hello to them. Hey, guys. Welcome. Amy, what city are you in?
I'm in San Francisco. Thanks for having me today.
This is great. We're going to look at some amazing stuff of yours. You and Mickey met when Mickey was at Autodesk, and you were doing amazing stuff with biology and 3D printing.
Yeah, thank you. I was an artist in residence.
Amazing. There. Yeah, amazing. And I bumped into Amy one day over at Pier 9 at the Artist in Residence program, and just seeing what she was doing was like my head started hurting a lot, and I just was like, what exactly is happening here? So we'll show and talk a little bit more about that. And then Claudia, I've never met you before, but you and Peter have talked, and you've got an amazing show going on, or going to be going on at Bitforms, and we've had Stephen on from Bitform Gallery. So thank you so much for being here today.
Amy, we'll get back to it a little bit, and welcome to these microphones, Claudia. You, as we get into your work, you have been working in this field of simulated reality. You know, to people who use it, it feels like a computer gaming world. And you've been as you and I were talking the other day, you started really dealing with the fact that that takes us in a different path towards reality than much of the traditional art world and the artistic tradition.
Yes, shall I just start? I mean, sure. I was actually trained not either as a technologist nor as an artist. So I was an artist, trained to be an art historian initially, and my special interest was Enlightenment art and the Enlightenment. So I was very interested in early computering and automatons and perspective machines and early cameras and all of this kind of thing. I was fascinated
now,
with
Claudia, when you're talking about the Enlightenment, just for my naive view or the audience out there, what era are you talking about, or what's the sort of time frame when you first started looking at early computing? Because this is you're not talking about like the homebrew computer club in the 70s or 80s. You're talking about much earlier.
Right. Well, I think my territory goes from neoclassicism and romantic poets and romanticism and the beginning of photography, the beginning of mechanical reproduction. And I was very obsessed with drawing machines and things of that order.
And when we say the Enlightenment, this is also the beginning of the scientific method. It's understanding that mankind comes from some natural law as opposed to what the king says. So that in many ways, and also the kind of the beginning of printing. So on some deep level, that created the operating system or the worldview that the Western world has had for 500 years.
Right. Yep. And also just exactly what you're saying, the beginning of the Enlightenment was, like our own time, very conflicted. There was romanticism at the same time as, right, there was Jean-Jacques Rousseau at the same time there were the philosophers, right, who were scientific. And there was this cultural conflict between the two. And I think we see this playing out ad infinitum, particularly now.
Maybe we should jump into this first piece of yours so we can see this. It's a piece called The Ruins, in which you're kind of, you describe it as a way of understanding kind of deconstruction going on now, and you start playing with Enlightenment themes. So maybe you should set this piece up for us, and then we can take a look at it.
Do you want to run the movie part?
Yeah, let's do that.
I can talk us into because the actual piece, this piece, it looks like it's swimming in there. There's a lot of noise. The show is a larger project that took me about 2 years to work to make, but this particular piece came as was at the beginning of not the beginning of COVID, but about some time into it, and was also a reaction to Black Lives Matter uprising and a deep desire to reconsider everything, the paradigms of Western culture. So it sort of fits exactly into what we're talking about. And I was actually invited, Steve and I had planned this show. The show is up right now and it's going to close on the 24th. And this is actually a 3-channel movie in the show. And we are going to go into Mozilla Hub's, which is web VR version, a facsimile of it at low resolution. But when I did this project, the one that's the 3-channel video, in which the audio is also really important. I don't know if the audio is running on this.
Omid, can we bring up the audio on this?
Yeah, can I talk over it, or is it too?
Go ahead.
All right, so I'm going to give it a moment. But the audio, okay, yeah, if you could turn it down a little so I could talk over it. So basically, the work here was based on the fact that at the beginning of COVID, it wasn't clear that my show could go on or any show could go on. And Steve had read a New York Times article about a game that's called Occupy White Walls that comes out of London. The guy who does it is called Yarden Yavlowski, and it's a multiplayer game. I think there's about 60,000 people in it. And his idea was that it's a gallery building game, and you can build a nifty gallery with parts that he provides. And he has a collection that consists of all the open source images that he was able to download. Can you still hear me? It's very...
Oh, yeah.
All right, good.
We hear you and it beautifully.
All right, good. So he was able to download from the Tate and the Art Institute of Chicago, where I am a teacher, and in fact, where I was very involved in the process with the director of the old museum to convince the then director, who's now gone, to make public the copyright-free images and also the Met. And so he downloads all these things, and you get a few of them to start, and you can curate shows with the Mona Lisa and Cezanne and all that. But Steve introduced him to my work, and he was very excited because he said, I would like to have you in the game because I was working with Matisse for various reasons, also a part of my research and classes that I teach. It's a project called the Romantic App, where we use paintings from the
ultimate aim of all
there we go again. Is the complete we use paintings from the Impressionism, Pre-Impressionism, and Post-Impressionism collection at the Art Institute to make augmented reality app, where we use the paintings as trackables, and we make an app where the students, the young people, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
All right, I'm screaming. Those are all me, by the way. And so, I project a lot. I'm small, but I project. So anyway, we make an app in conversation with the idea that the kids are experiencing a paradigm shift into simulations and post-photography moment. And the artists they're in dialogue with, we use as trackables paintings, and they integrate their animations that use contemporary language like glitch or all kinds of digital processes that were not possible pre-computer synthesis. And I charge them with the task of thinking about photography impacting painting at that point, how painting became flattened and more object-like and moved away from the job of representation as photography hit. And also they were interested in optics, light, the play of light, more scientific information. They were interested in data, how scientific information influences perception. So I asked the kids to make animations on top of that, and we work in the Art Institute. So going back to Yarden and the game Occupy White Wall, he was interested. I was working with Matisse because Matisse is the first artist really who is copyright protected. He belongs with Post-Impressionism by formal reasons, but due to timing and various factors that I don't really even understand, he was the first artist who was copyright protected. And all of his works are in the old museum and in the new museum, except for one. And this became an issue for both my students and me because it was forbidden territory. We're not allowed to work in the modern museum because all of those images are copyright rich. We work in the old museum because it's public domain. So Yarden said he would like to do a project with me. And the reason he wanted to do a project is Matisse is copyright protected, and yet he's a very populist and visual painter. And his gamers would like to play with Matisse paintings, but he can't because they are not public domain. So he asked me, would you like to make a show in my space? And I was at first very enchanted by the idea. And I thought at that point also about Hito Sterol's idea about the poor image. Have I lost you? I feel like I'm not.
No.
I'm still there?
Yes, and I'm interested to know where we go in this adventure of we all want to work with and remix Matisse, but we can't. So I'm kind of excited to figure out where this mixed culture story takes us.
Yeah, so it's about mix. And I teach also to my class Hito Sterol's theory of the poor image. So her idea here was that low pixel images open up a world of revolutionary possibility for artists, remix culture. You can't use high resolution, but you can grab, and make a bad photo.
We got a loophole. So the loophole is low res you get to mess with. So have at it, turn that into a new form of art, and the rest of it's some old thing.
Yes, exactly. So I teach that every semester in my romantic app class, which is called virtual installation. And I thought, low res images, gaming, low resolution polygons. I'm gonna I'm going to take them down to low resolution. As long as I'm doing Matisse, I might as well do Picasso, the patriarchs. And I made these very low resolution polygon models that I could import into his game, but also to Mozilla hubs, because there are strict limits on, especially for social VR, right? Because it's in its early phases. And
can you explain, just so that for the audience, what is Mozilla Hubs, or are we gonna jump in and take a look at that?
Yeah, we're
sounds like this is some kind of virtual space or something.
Yeah,
Can you explain a little bit of what that is?
I'm going to explain, and I'm setting us up for running around in the story. This is a backstory. So
perfect.
So I mean, I'm a storyteller. I teach for a living. That's what I do. Tell stories about history, basically. And so the idea here was that Hito took them, talked about poor images, and I would bring down Picasso and I would bring down Matisse to low resolution. And then I decided to very painstakingly copy the paintings, as I was formerly a painter before I started all this. I'm an image person. I went to architecture, and then it was during the 70s, what you call paper architecture, and they taught me how to draw beautifully, but it was pre-computer. So I'm interested in image. I am a representation, the issue of representation person. So I entered directly into simulations technology, and I was nowhere else. I've spent my entire life in the land of simulations. I've never glitched. I do glitch, but it's just part of my simulation. It's within my simulation.
And one of the points that
but you're not saying that you're a simulation, Claudia. Like you are a real person. You're not a avatar that Peter has foisted on us.
Yeah, no, but you will see me as an avatar when we go on Mozilla. So you were asking me what is Mozilla, and Mozilla is social VR. It's web VR.
Okay.
So if we're going to go in there and see it on our laptop here, right? But wait, I'm going to go in there too. But basically,
and Omid, can we share a public link to Mozilla? Can people visit it or something? Is there a public link out there that we can just share with the audience as well?
I'm popping in myself.
So this is.
Tell us what we're seeing now.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, yeah. So Omid has been posting where the gallery is located on the comments, so people can check it out themselves.
Omid should be in here too. Oh yeah, I see that he's here.
And this raises another interesting information or IP kind of thing, because here is a work that exists in social VR, and yet a gallerist in New York is selling it. So it also has a collectible limited edition version, right?
Right.
But this is great. So this is
Whoa, there's a spider in there. What's going on with
Yeah,
that?
okay,
that's me.
what's going on here?
I'm the spider. Where
Yeah.
are you? Oh, hi.
Okay.
So you are only seeing through your own eyes. So you're hooded merganser. You might like, if you click on the little three red icon or black icon thing in the upper right, you will it will tell you who's in the room, and you'll see me, and you can change your name in there if you want to claim your own name. You can also change your body, which is always fun. So if you click on hooded merganser 10370.
Wow. we are you're right. We're completely mixing up contemporary role-playing game technology and fine art.
Yeah. So basically,
you know what I'm worried about? Just
hi.
before we go too far, what I'm worried about is like Omid just shows that he's a ghost, and you know how you find out that like code that was written in the 70s or 80s, like COBOL code or whatever. When we got to the Y2K bug, you know, we were all nervous that it wouldn't roll over to having like the year 2000 in it because it was still running most of the world. What if that ghost that Omid created, what if that turns out to be what he has to be for the rest of his existence? Like in 1,000 years, we find out Omid is now a ghost, only living in this weird
I
pixel
don't
reality.
think that's possible, because as somebody who has been working with augmented, basically all my platforms go bankrupt, and I'm just, you know, holding my breath until this one does. So it's like, you know, you got to build, the avatars are provided by Mozilla, but the room I built myself, so that's forever, you know, because I made it in a stable format. I mean, as far as I'm concerned.
Tell us how we experience this room. Like, do you want to take us through a little bit, or
well, I want to backtrack and say that was how I ended up doing this. And you had on your site, you linked people to the Ars Electronica one, and so I thought, like, why should I give this to Yarden? Why should I give away my copyright? You know, if it was good enough for Matisse and Picasso, it's good enough for me. And I refused to do the game, and decided, because Ars Electronica invited us to do a remote site doing Bitforms vis-a-vis video. Yeah. And there were some people who were using Mozilla, and I thought, oh, I'm going to make a remote site. The remote site will be this model of the space. So I'm going to go. So this is a scale model of Bitforms. And Peter, going back to what we were saying about mixed reality and photography, I think the difference between simulations technologies and photography, as you said in your introduction, and you wrote, I think, on the site, is that photography is based on materiality. Light makes an imprint onto a piece of film or a paper, and it's concrete. So it proves itself through it proves the world is real through its own physicality, that it's like a fossilization of light. And in this world, exactly as you're asking, this is a mixed reality in which what precedes our representations in this form fairly simple, because it's web, is based on data. The data is factual and has been accumulated, Peter, since the Enlightenment and sped up now. And we work backwards from, with simulation, it's ephemeral data, and then the world is reconstructed more or less realistic. It has the physics of the real if we want it. It works with gravity in a real way if we want it. In this case, the plants are all animated. I hope it's still moving. And those are all using data about how a rubber plant might move in a certain kind of atmosphere, which I tweak and use. I use spatial information, which I distort because I try to create a confusion between flat and XYZ space. And in fact, the simulated space is a hybrid of a simulated lens meets the eye of the camera. You look through it, meets a calculus curved space, which is what VR is. It's a dome space. So I tried to flatten it and confuse it the way those artists were dealing with the confusion of spatiality back in Impressionism, post and pre. So this is like exactly what you're talking about, Peter. It's like data which is ephemeral in a parallel world to the real world. And it's the mix that makes it fun. The fact that, this is a scale model.
And you also, in our conversation, you also point out that as we move away from truths or nature that we hold self-evident, things become more fluid. And this also begins to suggest, right, we're in this kind of paradigm shift where we've gone from kind of one predictable world to another one. And in fact, I sent you, and we should publish for everybody, this wonderful article that Danny Hillis wrote a few years ago called "The Enlightenment is Dead, Long Live the Entanglement," in which he says that we have become so intertwined with what we've created that we're no longer separate from it. And he talks about that in the Enlightenment, we learned that nature followed laws. And then as we understood them, we could predict them. We created science. We shaped the world. We granted ourselves godlike powers. And then eventually we created new worlds from our imagination. And that, we go down that path, you start to get to the point that you imagine something, it's indistinguishable from what is real, or it is real. You talked about fluidity, it leads to anxiety. Like, I think we see this politically. It leads to fluidity in things like gender, which used to be certain, but isn't. And then that gets into kind of identity, which is another theme that you're playing with.
Yeah, that's totally true. And the other thing that I want to bring up is part of the piece was also that audio. And so as I was bringing down the patriarchs of the West, I was also dealing with the failure of utopian projects, and that the four voices that Ed Campion, I recorded four voices, and Ed Campion made a software called the Ruin software, where he played the sound. This is a pre-recorded 10-minute piece, but it's also able to be improvised, and we'll use it many times as we proceed with all this. And Ed Campion is there in San Francisco. He's a very amazing and respected composer, and also the director of the Center for New Music and Audio Technology, who I've been collaborating with for the past, I think, 4 or 5 years, where we've been working on the idea of virtual chambers for chamber music, meaning VR environments in which we can stream people in from all over.
By the way, I love the utopians, the failed utopias you picked. You picked Thomas Jefferson on American Liberty, so kind of an American utopia of his, the Bauhaus Manifesto by Gropius, Fordlandia, which was Henry Ford's kind of manufactured suburban reality.
Brilliant attempt in the Amazon rainforest, yeah. Fascinating.
And then Jim Jones. So here we go, flying from the Enlightenment through the Bauhaus era, the industrial era, and I don't know, weird stuff in the 1970s.
Yeah, right. So they get worse as they go on. So if you hear me like speaking, I sort of sound like myself as Thomas Jefferson. I'm maybe flattering myself, and then I get more pompous and insane as I go on. So the more pompous guy is me as Walter Gropius, and there I was thinking about the utopia of industry and technology, which has become, my generation was all about TV, which has become, on the other hand, IKEA and television descending into the internet, which is so much a part of these discussions, right? The fluidity and the collapse of truth. Yeah.
Well, I think if we wrap this back, though, like if we come back to sort of the way Peter started this, we are lock-ins inside of our brain, right? We don't actually experience reality at all. We experience it through, I guess David Eagleman, who's a neuroscientist, calls it the Mr. Potato Head theory of cognition. If you give us senses, our brain tries to figure out what they are and turns them into vision, or turns them into sound, or turns them into some correlation between multiple senses. And so we're always lock-ins, and yet during the Enlightenment and during the shift to photography, where it could do something mechanical, and I loved what you said, Claudia, fossilize light and help us see that, we suddenly believed, that we could pin reality down. But what seems to be happening now is that we're kind of unpinning it again. And you will hear people, I just watched the launch of the new Minecraft Live edition that's coming out this year, and millions of people around the world sort of live and build crazy things inside of Minecraft, and it's even lower resolution than what you just showed, and yet they're so excited to learn about the introduction of, caves or archaeology where you can actually dust away things, but it's like 7 pixels by 22 pixels, and yet people are exploring and living in this. One thing this reminds me of is W. Brian Arthur from the Santa Fe Institute explored the nature of technology, and he explored over the history of the universe, more or less, or at least life on Earth, how technology structurally deepens and fractally vascularizes. And effectively, the minute a new thing is introduced, it captures some phenomena in the universe, and we put it to human use. But then over time, it layers in layers and layers fractal vascularization. And I think what you're doing is this sort of interesting remix of Matisse, remix on top of an artist that did something around a gallery and a game, remix on top of everything else. So it's structurally deepening and vascularizing at a fractal level, and yet we get to choose which level of reality we believe in or we see. So just a fascinating space.
Well, I'm sorry, Peter.
Oh no, I was just going to say that we're coming up on the half an hour, so we're going to bring in Amy in a moment. But before we do that, I kind of interrupted you for a moment, but I think you had one more piece that we wanted to tee up, and then we've got more that we could look at kind of on the back half. But you had a very interesting kind of avatar piece that we were about to get to.
Well, I thought that was interesting to bring up because it's exactly speaking to what you just said. And this was a piece I did 10 years ago with my students. I always collaborate with my students because they are what keeps me grounded or something, or in the flow of change. And this one, it was a collaboration with 24 students. So I actually made a piece where I submitted an avatar to, I sort of tortured an avatar. I beat it against the wall and I dropped it from high spaces and I did horrible things to it using gaming technology. And I made an avatar that was trying to break their way out of the computer into the real world. So I had it making collisions, very brutal collisions with your monitor. So I then invited my students to create their own avatars and use the animation ragdoll animation that I had made for doing this sort of ragdoll death choreography. And they made avatars, their own, and they made their own environments and they made their own pieces. And then we cut it together as a kind of meta thing, in which every time the thing hit the wall, you would see it transform from one of us to the other one of us. And so I gave you 2 versions. You shouldn't show them all. It's actually an 18-minute piece.
Wow.
One is like of the one that's just me, where I change from one color to the next when I'm trying to beat my way out of there. And the other one is them going from one avatar body to the next. So it's exactly what you're talking about. And it's actually, my piece is called Dark Knight because it was when the Dark Knight Batman came out, and you had these underclass people who are trying to break their way out of this prison underground into the light. And it does seem sort of relevant to now. And so it's really about a prison break. And that is also what you're talking about. I think you guys are more utopianists, I believe. And I think I'm a little darker. I'm more like steampunk. So,
you just reminded me of, there's a wonderful book called The Quantum Thief by Hanu. And it's kind of a crazy, amazing exploration of can these virtual memories, virtual presences, simulations of ourselves, and he kind of entangles about 1 million of himself, and he's trapped in a prison. Can they escape out into the base reality? And you're reminding me of that. I'm not sure that either Peter, I think Peter probably is farther along the line of utopian some days. But then again, I think, it's more sort of hoping for the best, expecting the worst, and figuring out what we can make happen in a positive way. So
This, by the
maybe
way,
not so
is
steampunk as William Gibson or something.
I want to point out this is an interesting transition point to Amy, because when
Yes.
we were talking, let's put everybody on. So,
Hey,
let's
Amy,
just
come
bring
on
Amy
in.
up
Yeah,
here for a second.
Amy, bring
Hey,
on
Amy.
Amy.
Yeah,
Um,
hi, Amy. Do you
And
want to
turn
show
your
the
mute
move?
off, Amy.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Should we-
Claudia.
Can you get me out of this room so I can join you in your room? I'm stuck.
Oh,
I'm
yes.
stuck. I'm stuck inside. Wait a minute. Am
We
I
need a
here?
slightly different
You look
peripheral.
like you're in our room now.
Yes,
Wait a
we're
minute.
all here.
Oh, wait a minute.
agree
Where
that
am
we're
I?
anywhere, we're here. Amy, when you and we're about to see some amazing stuff of yours, but in our conversation, and you're working kind of at the edge of science with biology, you're manufacturing stuff using life science techniques, and you're kind of playing with godlike things, but you're also asking the question of how do we do this responsibly, or trying to focus us on the moral side of what we're about to create. And what was interesting is, right, you were making the point to me that so much of the world looks at things dystopianly, as does much of science fiction. And you're kind of playing with, well, maybe it doesn't have to be that way. But it is that question of when we grant ourselves godlike powers and invent reality, we could take it in whatever direction, or human nature. And that seems to be a theme.
Yeah, Amy, give us a little bit of an overview of where you're coming from.
Well, I like to, let me just start off by saying I'd like to think of myself as an artist not having godlike powers at all, but learning from nature, learning from these intelligences that are like much larger than our awarenesses, and then seeing how can I collaborate with nature, and how can I learn from that process. At the same time, a lot of the technologies and biotechnologies I see, especially companies, using in a way that's trying to control nature. And that's where the big concern is of the godlike power, because when we start introducing trying to control nature, and we don't have this huge awareness or big overview of the entire system, because we're too limited, we don't understand all these like interworking factors. That's where it gets very dangerous and concerning for me. So I am an artist that I work with natural systems and life systems as artistic subjects. I'm often called a bioartist. I consider the future and who we could become in the future as humans, who we could evolve to be, what our planet could be like. And I try to use the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, exponential technologies like 3D printing, bioprinting, AI, machine learning, these processes that are being used now, not just in technology as machines, but in biotechnology, that area where infotech and biotech merges. Yeah. I'm looking at that area, and I actually create artwork out of that in that area. So I look at my work as artifacts of a speculative future, because I'm thinking about the future and say how we can heal and enhance our bodies in the future, what that could look like, we could become. Then I'm actually working through the science and technology that would be used, say, in the medical environment as one example, to help us get there. And so I make these artifacts in that process of working through that and asking the questions. So I'm thinking about this interplay where, I guess, if we were talking earlier about the avatars and that being 2D, I'm more in the 3D realm of the, say, cyborg. But what I'm looking at is not so much of a cyborg. I'm thinking at it from a perspective of, like, say, let's look at a pacemaker. When you look at somebody in front of you with a pacemaker, we don't see somebody who's a cyborg, even though now some of the pacemakers can be, the doctors can look in from their computer, and especially with insulin pumps, but we don't look at those people as being cyborgs. We look at somebody's life who's been saved, a grandparent or a spouse, a child, and we see the living person in front of us. So this is the area that I am very interested in, where the infotech and the biotech merge, but still at this nexus of bringing out our humanity. How could we enhance what
Amy,
it means to be human?
I feel like I really want just to give everyone a sense of, like, when I experienced you for the first time. So I'm walking through this, this cool shop maker place called Pier 9, and you're playing around with scanning your hand, but then you're like morphing it to almost like Edwardian lace, or maybe I don't know exactly. And then you're playing with getting your own stem cells and creating a bioreactor. Can you walk us through that project as a way so that the audience really has a sense of what we're talking about here? Because you've said some things like 3D printing, but you're not talking about 3D printing with plastic. You're printing with collagen. You're printing with like actually what makes a heart, what makes a bone before we dope it. Can you walk us through that piece of art?
It's my pleasure. Are you able to see my screen?
Let's see. Yep.
Okay, or actually, I can ask for a video to be shared.
Yeah,
Regenerative reliquary.
go ahead. Let's play
And
that
then I'll show
video.
on the screen.
So Omid, bring up the reliquary. Let's show
So
that
what we're
full
looking
size.
at here is actually the back end of the process. And then I'll kind of work backwards and explain it again. Can you show the final piece, Omid? And then we'll show this process again. Here it is. This piece is called Regenerative Reliquary. It's bioprinted out of a biodegradable material called hydrogel. This is a scientific media that in the lab we can grow cells on. The idea is that this piece is a host for stem cells to grow into bone. So over time, the scaffold dissolves, that yellow piece dissolves, and bone grows into the form. Omid, could you play it again from the beginning, and I'll explain a little bit of the process, because we saw some of the process. So stem cells are triggered to become the kind of stem cells I use, mesenchymal cells, MSCs, are triggered to become bone cells by certain properties, and one of the major properties being the shape. And are you able to see the video?
That's not playing again. Yeah, can you try to restart that?
Can we play that from the top?
I can show some slides too.
Oh, here it goes.
So what I did was I scanned my hand and then made another design. It looked like it skipped over that part. And in the computer-aided environment, I used a program that is actually used and FDA approved and used for hip implants. Now these hip implants were so successful, metal hip implants, that bone started growing them into place. So we knew that this would work. I collaborated with different scientists to figure out, what medium would dissolve. And so basically I 3D print this scaffold on the microscopic level. Even though we see it as a large form, the design in it that actually hosts the stem cells is a very small scale. And then over time, this yellow material dissolves. So now, I think it's really important to iterate that this is artwork. This is not for medical use at this point, but the idea is to open minds to envision what we could create with our biotechnologies. And this is based in actual scientific research.
So that structure, one of the things that's fun is that there's a weird, I guess for the hip bone replacements, that structure is, what did you call it? Is it microtubercular structure? I'm trying to remember what the naming was.
Yeah, on the tubercular structure. And I'd like to share my screen again. Is it doing something funny? Is it sharing?
Omid, can you pull up Amy's screen?
I'm sharing. I'm going to share it right now. Are you able to see this?
Oh, yeah, we can see that now.
Okay, so
and so
I'm
that tubercular structure, it seems like actually creates the stems. It tells the stem cells kind of which way to grow and how to actually grow over time in some ways, so that other stuff can dissolve. Oh,
so
okay.
If you can see here, this is the spongy part of bone. That's the tubercular bone structure. This was a piece of bone that I found washed up on the shore. But then this is the actual piece. So on the bottom, you see what was 3D printed. That's part of the hand design on a microscopic level, and then how it grows into bone. And you can see this is very small on that level. And you can see me looking at it there for just an idea of scale. So this is the process, but the questions that I'm asking are much larger, about a future where we can make replacement parts and who we become because of those parts. So there is this medical side, but then there's also the human condition side. I was born with a life-threatening birth defect where I was missing skin and bone on my head, and I'm still actually missing a piece of my skull. So growing up, I always wanted to be like the other kids. I had a number of experimental surgeries that didn't work until one worked when I was a teenager. But there was also, so there was this interest in healing and enhancing the body and medical futuring and just getting the next surgery that would work, trying that out and seeing if it would help. But there's also this human condition part of making peace with the limitations of the body and understanding, how to feel freedom within the constraints of the body. And usually we don't have to face those things till we're much older and we become sick or loved ones become sick. So I feel like with all my artwork, there's this intertwining theme of not just like the healing and enhancing the body, and also this, question of what it means to be alive, what it means to be not alive, and also this human condition aspect. So this piece was really interesting in that regard too, because my mother was a biochemist and a pharmacist, and I grew up assisting her in the lab. She decided she passed away of ovarian cancer when I was pretty young. And so at one point when we were doing these tests, the scientist said to me, oh, you know what, we should really test with cancer cells. And immediately I was like, no, I had a very visceral reaction because of my experience with my mother. And I feel her presence when I make this kind of work. Like I feel her with me because, I think about our special time together. But then I went back and I thought about it, and I trust the scientists very much. And I'm thinking, if they recommend this, then I'm going to do it. And it actually brought me to this much greater awareness of thinking about what it actually meant to be alive. Because I thought, what if I had her cells? What if I could use her cells on this piece and they continued to live on? What if they were her cancer cells? What does that mean? It's not the same as having my mother in front of me. So it brings up this whole line of questioning of what it means to be alive at this area of biotech. Like we can measure if a cell is alive or dead, but what are all these other influences and other factors of what it means to be alive? And I'm also thinking about this other aspect too of bioprinting. So I'm really into bioprinting because this to me is like the next frontier of 3D printing. This is the area that can be most disruptive and like make the most impact on our lives. Modern medicine has done a really great job of keeping us alive to a full lifespan, but to actually live beyond that lifespan to like say 300 years, 500 years, how do we do that? One option might be to make replacement parts, and bioprinting has that kind of promise.
You have a piece that you did.
And this can be kind of scary. Before we go past that though, one of the interesting things that when I saw that, I remembered the famous story of the ship of Theseus, which was discussed, 400 or 500 BC with Plato and others. And the idea was, if I replace one piece of this ship, this wooden plank is getting a little rotted, and I replace that. And then I replace another piece of this ship over the course of the next few years, and I keep replacing the ship. Is the ship the same ship at the end? And we've heard weird stories about people who've gotten like heart transplants or lung transplants or other things, where they actually the people who got those transplants feel, some kinship with, with the donor, and they actually have these kind of almost anniversaries with the family that unfortunately lost their son or daughter, but they know a piece of them is living on somewhere. So it's very, it's so complicated, and yet it's part of life. And I think you're pushing on. We might think this might be really far out. You did that piece a number of years ago, actually, and you're now doing even more things. Maybe this would be where Peter was trying to go, is show us some of the newer work.
Well, there was a piece you did with the heart, where I think you tried to both make a more emotional piece, but you were also playing with this notion that if you ingested enough big data about hearts and imaging, that starts to play with this notion of how might one do a better one, or one that might improve one's life, so let's take a look at that one.
I'll show two pieces that you touched on there. I'll show the heart piece first. And I have a short video that, if you could play the short video with audio on the heart of evolution, so you can see it moving.
Will there be audio on this?
think we're not getting audio, but.
So I just, this is the first iteration of work that I'm doing. I'm going to go back to screen sharing now.
Yeah.
This is the first iteration of work that I'm doing with bioprinting vasculature and simultaneously the heart, but they don't have to go hand in hand. So I'll talk about both sides of that. First off, let me see. I'm working with vasculature, bioprinting vasculature, because if we can bioprint vasculature, this is a very interesting, this would help really push the technology forward and bioprinting forward. Now, we've heard a lot of information that, oh, somebody 3D printed a heart, somebody 3D printed organs. I actually have not found, and I'm tapped into the 3D Heals International network of healthcare practitioners and scientists, researchers that work in this field. I've actually never heard of somebody making a complete viable organ yet. So there's some confusion with that, with the news, but there are a lot of people making a lot of progress. All my work is based in that research and in that line of field. If there's some way I can contribute, technically, that's amazing. But really, I think my work is in that juncture of trying to open minds to think on a different scale of how we can bring all these different disciplines together. So I'm working with bioprinting the vasculature on the scientific side, because if we can start to bring nutrients, oxygen, things that, you know, vasculature and blood in our bodies would bring to an organ, we're that much closer to making viable organs. At the same time, I was thinking about the heart. And I was thinking about the heart as this, you know, the sit emotional seat of consciousness in our body. So it's not just a vital organ, it's also this emotional organ that we relate with joy and feeling. And so, you know, if we start to make alterations to our form or switch out our parts, who do we become in the process? Just how Mickey was speaking about feeling somebody, or, you know, having somebody live on in you through your body and through your organs. We really scientifically don't understand that area of being alive at all yet. And I was with my friend Lisa after she had a double lung transplant in the transplant house where she was recovering at UPenn. And it was really interesting to talk to people from all different religions, all different belief systems, that they all reported this feeling of feeling like in some way there's something new about them, something that they felt differently from having that organ inside of them. We're not just talking about physically, it's emotionally as well. So I kind of keep going back and forth between this emotional and physical area. I worked with a cardiac surgeon to determine how can I design the heart to improve function. This is all speculative at this point, but you know, right now we have a faulty design with three main arteries that if one of those gets blocked, you could die. So how could I design something that would be better function for the heart? And then also, like I said, simultaneously thinking about the emotional component of that as well. And with both of these pieces, I present them both as scientific specimens housed in a bioreactor, because you know, I'm looking at this in a scientific perspective, but also as relics, because it's something that I feel like should be celebrated with a sacredness and really approached in that kind of sacred way. There's also this other element too. I have some, I think, pictures here of relics. I was born and raised Catholic, so I grew up looking at these, this kind of relics, you know, hands that were cut off or hearts. And it was so bizarre to me that these dead objects had a mystic agency that would, you know, cause miracles for the living, even though it was something that was dead. And this seemed really backwards to me, because it seemed like this was the antithesis of the awe and mystery of life, of that kind of godlike area that we, across all religions, we don't have an answer to, across science, philosophy, you know, we don't have an answer to what is life, where does life come from? So I wanted to kind of flip that script, and instead of celebrating the dead, to celebrate that part that was alive.
You know, it's very interesting. Last year, I went on a little bit of a pilgrimage through the Basque country of Spain and was able to go to Santiago de Compostela, which is where St. James' finger is or something, you know, and you go there and there's this, exactly what you just showed, this amazing church. And inside the church, you know, people standing in line in the pouring rain to get inside, and you get in and it's this incredible chapel for the bone of St. James, you know, and the blessing that can come from that. But I like your inversion of this, the notion of kind of thinking about how do we create even relics from the future that give us pause, maybe help us think about things. I know that what happened for me when I first met you, and when people who are working on really hard design, engineering, architecture things, when you see something like what you were doing, I think it just opens our brains up. Like it's very hard to look at anything the same after you've seen that. You start to imagine things differently, and I suspect your work with the physicians, with the doctors, with this network that you work with, it helps them get out of the everyday and actually imagine and leap, maybe across some metaphor space to think differently about their own research. And do you find that, like, what do you see happen after your sort of artist, resident artist engagements and things? What do you see happening with the people that are there?
I feel like that's a really big part of my role. It's to be this like provocateur. To see like what can we do with this research? How can we visualize it? And it's this beautiful collaboration. I have to collaborate with scientists and technologists on almost all of my works. And it's this really amazing thing when we can say, start with this very inspiring scientific research and then go through the process of making an art piece. So for example, with regenerative reliquary, some of the really valuable aspects to the scientists and technologists were that this was the largest 3D printed scaffold known to be made even to this day. Now I wanted something that was human scale. I wanted something that you can come to in a museum and immediately recognize it as human. So all of our bones, skulls, and hands are the most recognizable. So the art drove that forward, and the requirements of the materials that wouldn't time out through really long printing times. So this brings up a really interesting concept that usually scientists are doing this work in a lab on a really small scale, like that little sample that I showed you next to the dime. And the public doesn't see these experiments, and we can't bring that articulation to life. Like, what could this really look like? But when I illuminate it through kind of this relic of something that looks human, and it brings up all these questions about what does it mean to be alive, transhumanism, like when do we die? It starts this whole new conversation that a lot of the scientists and doctors that I meet get into their practice because they're asking those kinds of big questions. Doctors want to heal people. Scientists are asking, like, what is nature? What is the nature of nature? What is life? But in a scientific conference or a medical conference, professionally, at least in America, it's kind of frowned upon when you ask those kind of questions. It's a little out of the realm of what is known to be a certain type of professionalism. However, as an artist, I have the space to be able to get up there and show my work and say, I'm asking these questions, and it brings us together in a way to open a dialogue that's more imaginative. It makes a joint space for exploration that is both conceptual and technical.
I think you've done such a great job laying out the role of the artist in residence when it comes to technology, new materials, and new ideas, right? The artist doesn't just represent some piece of technology. You're pushing us to look at things differently, right? You're looking at the fact that here's a substrate, but these are live stem cells, and the work changes over time, and then that forces us to start thinking about the role of creation and stem cells and stuff. And in the case of the heart, you're playing with big data, and you're pushing us into thinking about the creation of things. So that's a reframing and a looking at things differently, which is an enormous service to get, the public and people to think about things. But you're also pointing out that they're almost a set of things, whether you're a medical scientist and you have to go down the straight and narrow, or you're a product manager in Silicon Valley and you have to follow your shipping path, artists get to ask bigger questions and help us look at things differently. And particularly when we're at the frontier of science and life, it's cool.
Someone once described this to me. So I worked at an interesting lab a while back, and we all read a book about, I think it was called Proust as a Neuroscientist. And it's actually a fairly bad book if you care about science, because there's a lot of bad assertions about it. But within it, and I'm not going to recommend it as a good science book. But it's fascinating because it was about how artists presupposed Proust with the eating a Madeleine and having a burst of memories from childhood. It turns out that our tongue and our nose are the most directly connected through the lizard brain to sort of our senses, and memories that you remember least are the most vivid. And so, because they're not retread over and over again, like, your birthday from when you were 10. And so we started talking about this, and the notion was scientists are kind of climbing this mountain of what is possible. Like these are all the ways we found how to build a wing, that creates lift by lowering the pressure on top and the bottom. So these are all the things that didn't work as we were climbing this mountain to try to make, human powered flight or something. And so science is about kind of cutting away and trying to have some predictability about the future around what's possible based on physics or something. Art says, is this the right mountain? Look over there. There's a totally different mountain over there. Have you guys thought about climbing down and going over there? And scientists don't always like the idea of climbing down because you get you're at a local maximum, and you have to actually get worse before you get better to go up another mountain that might be bigger. And I think what you're doing, Amy, and what Claudia as well, is sort of questioning what is reality, and might we climb other mountains? Might we explore other things? And you're doing that, I think, years ahead of what maybe scientists or popular culture might get to, right? So that's very exciting and humbling as well. So very, very wonderful. Let's bring Claudia on as well. I'd love to have her back into the conversation.
I'm so excited to all talk now too. I was like, after she spoke, I'm like, I don't even want to present. Let's just start talking.
No, I have a question specifically inspired by your work.
There we go. Here we are.
Yeah, so
Can
you hear me?
There we go.
All right.
Here we are. We're all here.
So Amy, I'm inspired by your work because when I saw it, I immediately thought Frankenstein and romantic, the anxiety that was expressed by Frankenstein. So it's like my thing is romanticism, and I don't think my job actually, Mickey, is to point the direction for scientists to go, but I'm expressing the emotions of the people of now with like what's happening. And so anyway, in fact, yesterday I was with a curator who said the longer she spent in the show, the more sad she got. And that it was about a nostalgia about the loss of a thing that cannot be recaptured. And in that case, it was also, we can't go back to thinking about these things in the same way. And I saw your work as expressing the same kind of anxiety. Like mine is about loss. And I do think that its strength is I use all these contemporary processes, but the art is the image. And the image is how people feel with their hearts, although it's not their hearts, it's actually their heads. But I think, your things, yes, Catholic reliquaries, talk about steampunk, right? Like goth, scary, it's expressing the fear that people feel now about this area is one of the most frightening that we have. Part of the reactionary Trumpism is anxiety about these kind of things. They're so scared they want to repeal everything, right? So because they're scared because it moves so fast. And I think can you respond to that? About the actual physical experience or psychic experience of your art. Forget about understanding what you're talking about.
I think actually that's like the area as an artist that I feel like I communicate best. I didn't start speaking about my work till about 4 years ago. I was getting a lot of requests, so I'm like, okay, I guess it's time. But I really felt like my work is successful when it has an emotional response within like the first second of seeing it. Like people just have a deep emotional response. Yeah, and connection. And, you only saw kind of a little glimpse of my work here today. But there's a piece I want to show, if we can go back to screen sharing real quick, that I want to really comment on this piece. Are you able to see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so this piece, Peter was mentioning earlier about that I had some work where I'm looking at big data and how we can redesign new forms. I'm not going to get into the explanation too much right now, but this piece I posted on social media. It was made with artificial neural networking, and I was looking at new designs of the body. But also in all of my works, I'm thinking about life and death, and all these overlapping themes. I mean, as an artist, we bring our entire experience to making the work. And the way that I see my work is that I'm more of a channel, and the artwork comes through me. So I'm consciously asking these questions. I'm keeping my mind really busy by giving myself super hard tasks, like how to bioprint with pegged to hydrogel, the time's out. Like, you know, it's like making a puzzle where your brain is really busy, so other things come through. When I put this piece out on social media, an EMS worker that always seemed very stoic, my kind of old boys club a little bit to me, contacted me. And he's like, this is the exact vision I see when people die. He's like, I'm not going to give his name because he's like, I don't really tell people about this. I think they think I'm crazy. But what you're showing here is what it looks like when people die. And he sees people die all the time. So to me, this is the kind of feedback and affirmation that I get, that the artwork really emotionally resonates with people in a way that's more of a universal experience, and a way of communicating that is beyond language, beyond that thinking mind, beyond that knowing mind. I couldn't say where that comes from in me, but I definitely, you know, I do think through those issues a lot. Death has really impacted my life from a young age. So it's affirmation to me to see how that comes through in the work and people respond to it. It's also really interesting to be in a museum. We can stop screen sharing now. It's also really interesting to me to be in a museum and hear somebody talk about my work when they don't know that I'm the artist.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, I feel like I've set up these intellectual constructions, you know, how I make my work, having come through, you know, I didn't go to art school, but I went to a very conceptual architecture school, paper architecture one. And I found at a certain point that everybody who saw my work said, it's very sad. Your work is so sad. And I gave a talk at the Guggenheim of this piece that should show when we break, the one with the kids did it, right? And he said to me, a guy in the audience said, don't you feel bad that you're doing that to an avatar? Like that I was cruel and that was brutal. And I thought that was like, he identified with it and he felt this sort of sadness and brutalness of the experience.
I did too, actually, you presenting earlier, one specific with a certain drawing, it made me feel nauseous. Like with the avatar hanging there, like I physically had that feeling.
So I think like in the end, that's what matters. I mean, and we're dealing with things that are very topical. And they therefore are the things that people are very worried about. You know, that's why we're experiencing reactionary politics now, because they're so scared. And I think, like, I don't know, like we're a vehicle for them to, I don't know, you know, what our job is, but we're doing it for ourselves, maybe, and that's what art does. It's a liminal space, right, where people can.
Claudia, in the Enlightenment, as we were kind of going from the Dark Ages into something new, as that happened, there was also reactions going on. There are probably examples in history, or even in the Industrial Revolution, where like we can learn what it's like, because there's this schism. I think you made this point. We were talking the other day that we don't. I think it was you that it might have been Amy, because we've been talking a lot lately. But it's when we recede from the old world, we don't quite know what we're going into yet, right? We're kind of in this liminal period where things are deconstructed and being put together differently, which is, I think, the frightening thing that leads to reactionary stuff, that leads to why you want to go back to when it was great again, and all that nostalgia that we have, right? What can we learn from art history, other examples of that? Because I think this is exactly this deconstruction, reconstruction moment, and that's kind of what Hill has talked about in his piece.
I think that's what art's job is, actually. That's our job, is to like be this social space of where people can empathize and grapple with these kind of big issues. And
Yeah.
there are certain things that art is always about, right? Identity, life, dying, sex, love. Is there anything else? Sort of like maybe that's the whole thing.
The range
New
of the human-
iPhones?
What?
the
Yeah,
range of the human
New
condition.
iPhones.
yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
You know,
I think,
both of you
yeah.
just made me think of something here. I'm just reacting to this. You know, I recently finished a book that was written by Walter Isaacson, who has chronicled a number of sort of geniuses. His new book is coming out about Jennifer Doudna, called Codebreaker, who just won a Nobel Prize like yesterday for CRISPR. And I decided to read an older book called The Innovators, and he starts with Lord Byron, who was a bit of a rascal, and his wife wanted to raise a child but didn't want him exposed, so had a painting of Lord Byron in the living room, but a veil over it so that his daughter couldn't ever see him, and she only really knew him as a very small child. But he disappears all over the continent and starts doing things. He's a poet and a raconteur, and he ends up doing a weekend with Mary Shelley and crew. And during the weekend, they decide to like write horror stories and silly stories. And one of the horror stories that comes out of it is Frankenstein. And meanwhile, his daughter is playing around with this guy, Charles Babbage, and in love with math. Her mom decided that she would become mathy so that she wasn't a rascal like Lord Byron. And her name is Lady Ada. And she ends up basically looking at looms that are actually manufacturing fabric with punch cards, and thinks, what if we could make loops of those looms by taping the punch cards together? And what if we could make the looms make music? And she's the first computer programmer, right? So she's known in history, Lady Ada, as the first computer programmer. And it's very interesting because she was kind of art and science and math, and Mary Shelley was questioning even this enlightenment, because suddenly we could try to go from natural philosophy to science and try to animate the world and figure out how the world is animated. And it feels like in every epoch we're in this space of trying to understand, and we have both artists and scientists and just society and pop culture all churning together, trying to figure out what is reality, what is true. So it was interesting to hear you react, Claudia, to Amy's piece and say Frankenstein, and you know, which was all about a modern day Prometheus, and yet, you know, these actually come together because Amy, you're like playing with neural networks and trying to figure out how to evolve, you know, the heart musculature and things. So there's a fun intersection at this moment.
I think, you know, we are on the cusp of a new renaissance here if we use our technology that way. Like, we have the tools to take on an identity that's aspirational, whether it is an avatar or a cyborg, whether it's 2D, 3D, real world, virtual. And but I feel like it really requires consciousness. This is where like my commentary comes into it, of not just synthesizing that and witnessing it, but saying, you know, we have to have, instead of just being so reactionary, how can we use that? How can we really think about who we want to be, who we want to become as an individual, as a society? And how do we use our technologies to help shape us there? Instead of this like acting out like a childish teenager in a technological infancy of, you know, just being reactionary and seeing what happens and, you know, being rebellious, to actually, you know, come together and use these tools for our best and highest good. Now, you know, my artwork, I'm thinking about that as an individual, but my artwork doesn't necessarily always portray that. I feel like both sides of it show up, and with Claudia's too, right? That's
well,
what
Peter, you gave me an article to read. I feel like I have to go over and get it.
Is this digital analog or Danny's piece?
The second one, the long one. Yeah.
Yes, this was a piece in the New Atlantis, which talks about this phase change. It's called The Digital City and the Analog City. And what it really talks about is that more analog, certain world and the digital world that's more made up and full of change and how much anxiety producing it is.
And he talks about identity.
Yeah.
And how we have this transitioning idea about what is solid. And it's all slipping away in terms of our anxiety about our own identities. And I think, so when you are talking about truth, or, you know, providing a future that is more bright, I'm wondering if it's possible, actually. You know, that article, I love that article that you gave me, because he talks about being, you know, stuck in this enmeshed knot, in a way, right?
Yeah, we'll have to put that up. And what triggered that article, you know, there's so many great connections across these shows. We had one of your students, Leani, who put together the Gray Area Festival, was on a couple weeks ago. And last week, we had on Andrew McLuhan, Marshall McLuhan's grandson.
Oh, cool.
Who's teaching a course at Gray Area for the next 12 weeks. And in many ways, that article picked up where McLuhan left off, talking about how as we change our media, it changes us. And I think you're right. This is this exponential change that forces us to question identity, puts us all in a global village, and then puts us into kind of realities that we can create, is so disruptive that, you know, on the one hand, as recently as the 1960s, when we had World's Fairs and we saw what the future looked like, we had a common vision of the future. And it'd be wonderful to have a positive common vision that perhaps we could solve climate and work on other problems. And yet, at this fundamental level, how do you do it, even when you see the conflicts in this country, which are these giant social schisms that even begin with, is science valid, or do I get to make up my own set of questions? So, right, we're in a moment of raising more questions than we have answers for, I think, is a thing we're learning, which COVID, by the way, explained, right?
Well, you know, Peter, I want to react to that a little bit. You just made me I mean, I haven't read the New Atlantis article, so we should definitely post it. I know you sent it to me, but I'm a slacker. You know, looking at Amy's work, looking at Claudia's work, and thinking about the sort of intersection of both the, you know, the pixels, bits, polygons side of the world, and also the tangible world, where the tools of production are getting down to the point where, you know, for $400, you can get a printer not unlike the one that Amy just used for her reliquary on Amazon, and high school kids are using it to experiment. I think you were using an Ember printer, and now they're like about $400 on Amazon. So it's a bizarre kind of a thing where bits and atoms are actually starting to play together in really weird and interesting ways. And maybe we've always been in that space. But what I started thinking about was, I recently attended the Synthetic Beta Bio Conference, or Synth Bio Beta Conference, which was just people who've been getting together for years to kind of explore what it means as we start having the tools to be able to do things like try to come up with a vaccine for the COVID virus, you know. And we emailed that around the world, by the way. The minute it was sequenced, the COVID virus was in the hands of researchers because it had been digitalized, and we could do things with it. And we do have multiple vaccines in trials. It'll still be another probably 18 months before we see anything safe. We don't know. But what's interesting is, in that conversation, one of the things you learn about in that conference is there's something that's been running for 15 years with high school kids and undergrad students called the iGEM competition. And the iGEM competition is the International Genetically Engineered Machines or something competition, where high school kids and college kids with teams compete, probably, you know, 30 or 40,000 now, compete to actually create biobricks that are valuable and useful. And they have to write a Wikipedia page to explain the science, the theory, what they built. They use a wetware library, and they actually build real biobricks that are usable. and also document the ethical and policy concerns. And they basically run through kind of future scenarios about what the ethics might be if this happened. Yes, they made a glow in the dark, bunny rabbit. But what are the ethical implications of, these things? And I think what was fascinating about that was actually I think they were very humble and thoughtful, the whole community, about sort of how do we create a sandbox that's a safe place to play about these things before they suddenly, surprise us, before they're in the world. And I think a lot of what I see happening with both of what you're doing is you're letting us play with these things in maybe a little bit of a safer place than if it suddenly, comes knocking on my door and it's a reality. And anyway, that just it inspires me to think about how do we create a safe place for kids to be kids, for us as adult kids to be kids, to even scare ourselves, right? The grim fairy tales were not happy fairy tales. Kids love to be scared, and so I think that's a part of it, is that we get to exercise, we get to actually try to think about what these implications are in a bit of a safe place.
Well, the digital city, Peter, was about the paradigm of fluidity. And so the idea there was that in the analog city, people could be sure of outcomes. And in the culture of fluidity, the digital city, we have the idea of fluidity and unsure outcomes, but also of play. And I think, I proposed to Steve that they do a online gallery, Bitforms, in Mozilla Hubs. And there's another software that, in fact, Gray Area used for their festival, which is called New City, I think. And I really wanted the hubs because they have crazy avatars, and you can beam in your video of yourself, and you can run around and act sort of kooky. And I felt that it allows grown-ups to play in a kind of, within this environment that is normally threatening, right, to grown-ups, which is the sort of game simulations world. And I somehow feel, whoever said play, was that you, Mickey?
You're saying here that at a time when there's this whole new fluid, playful way of looking at things, but also a generational divide, is there some mechanism here that bridges that and is, which is perhaps what an art gallery play thing, is that kind of what you're thinking?
Well, art is also play. I remember, when you start doing it, you feel a little embarrassed when once you decide to do it seriously and you're going to be in the art world. At least I did. I thought, this is embarrassing. Like, I'm supposed to pretend that I believe all this.
Steve and I did a show at the Aspen Institute a few years ago with some of his data artists. We called it The Art of Data. It was people like Luc Dubois and a bunch of people who were having fun ways of visualizing things. And we did it because we realized, this is like 5-6 years ago, that the topic of big data was a very intimidating, mathy thing to introduce to a bunch of people who are very smart and kind of leaders, but aren't familiar with algorithmic stuff, right? And so we realized if you showed art, that
the average age of a person at the Aspen Ideas Fest
people
is
in their 60s or 70s.
97.
Really? Is that true? No.
I mean, they're
our parents, right?
They're very wealthy billionaires, but they're
My parents aren't alive anymore, but not yet. All right.
But like Steve would do or like Duke did a map where he recast cities by the words that people use in dating profiles, and instantly when you look at it, you get a sense for the psychographics and the story and how it uses data. And then it immediately forces you to ask questions like, well, that's a tiny town. Is that significant data? And it gets you into the fact that, well, there are only 5 data points, so that's less reliable. Whereas right. So it just takes you down a natural path to learn and ask questions. And it was delightful to see how it just slid the people who were smart but older and thought they were intimidated, but then they didn't realize
they weren't comfortable with data. But then by the end of it, of course, they were having data questions and comments and
maybe that's the list. I left off the list, Amy. Aside from death, is play, right?
Amy, you did a piece.
The same, right? Yeah.
You did a piece that plays with this in an interesting way. It was a piece you did for the Smithsonian,
Mhm.
And kids love dinosaurs. And the Smithsonian
Oh.
recently digitized their collection, and they turned to you with a very detailed digitization of a dinosaur skeleton. And you made an artifact, but then you brought into it your own kind of cellular design stuff, and then you brought into hacking evolutionary biology, because then you started playing with, imagine if this structure evolved in some separate path of evolution thousands of years ahead or backwards.
Exactly.
And I
I
thought,
thought if we can share screen
yeah,
while you're
let's take
talking.
a look at that, because here you're
Yeah, we
essentially
have to see
playing
that.
with evolution, which okay, how cool is that? So tell us about this one, and then we'll go into these structures you created from this.
So, I didn't know how I felt about working with dinosaurs. I usually work with humans, what it means to be human, what it means to be alive. But when the Smithsonian reached out to me, I was really excited and happy to work with them. And like you said, this coincided with their open access, so the release of like 3 million images into public domain and data sources. So they wanted me to work with their data and show what can be done in this way to kind of open minds of different ways we can use this data. So when I was thinking about that, I was like, well, what would be an important piece to work with? And they had digitized Hatcher, which was a triceratops. This was an old triceratops, first shown in like the early 1900s. And at the time that they showed it, they didn't have a full triceratops skeleton. So they had to cobble it together with other dinosaur bones. And in the mid 90s, they scanned the dinosaur and then rescaled the bones and cast and made the bones for the skeleton to try to show more accurately what this triceratops would look like on display. And so with that history in mind, this was actually considered the first digitized dinosaur. It was the first time like a museum piece was scanned, a dinosaur was scanned, and then parts were remade in that way. So I took that legacy, I took that scan data, and then I was thinking about, okay, now that we're at this era of biology and technology coming together, it's that next step of scan data, that scan data is no longer just about the 3D and taking form, say, learning the bones, maybe learning how this animal moved. It's now about actually scanning genetic information. We're learning more and more information from fossils. Sometimes there's DNA trapped in it. Sometimes there's, like woolly mammoths captured in ice. And there's this whole science now on a different kind of evolution. Like if we can bring extinct species back by merging them with their cousins here, like a woolly mammoth and an elephant, what new species would evolve? What could we learn from that? So I was thinking about those concepts and applied some of these structures that maybe cellular forms could take hold of. And this is all very like speculative at this point. And I made these dinosaur sculptures, and now I finished them with precious metals, because again, like the relics, I'm trying to show that these are something we have to think about with a very precious regard. We can't just play with these ideas of nature of like, hey, let's bring back an extinct species and see what happens. It would be like a Jurassic Park situation. I also, made some of these in that like deep time stratification, like when you drive past a hill that's been in an earthquake and you can see the strata exposed. So first you have questions about that, and then I'll move to the other related piece with it.
I guess we have to have Jeff Goldblum come on our show at some point, from Jurassic Park. Just nature finds a way. I love the idea of sort of re-evolving or playing out, a lot of what they say in the way that nature and technology evolves is that it finds a solution. It may not be the best solution. It goes back to your heart comment. We have the way the heart evolved. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the best approach. It's just that once it becomes a set point, that becomes path dependent for the future of the evolution of that place. So like you can see an octopus's eye doesn't have an optical nerve that gives the octopus a blind spot, but ours does, because they had parallel evolutionary paths with different sort of path dependencies. So I think it's fascinating to say, what if you were to turn one knob and let evolution play back out again?
So that's
This also
actually what I continued to do with these pieces. And it's amazing that you just totally tuned into that, because I don't think you were on when I was talking about this piece with Peter. So now stop screen sharing and show the short video on morphologies of resurrection. What I did from here was to take a small portion of the Triceratops spine and then try to go through in the computer-aided design learning environment different points in time of evolution of how this could evolve into very different forms. I also printed this with a biocompatible material, because even though I'm not experimenting with this with cells, I was thinking about this prospect of, you know, what if we're actually going to start to put cells onto these forms and try to grow these forms? What's the co-evolution that continues to occur? So in the computer-aided design environment, I kind of made this like tuning scale. So at different points in time, I can stop and make these representations. But now we're not quite there yet with the technology, or at least I'm not, you know, versed enough in machine learning to be able to do machine learning in 3D. So there's a lot that I have to fill in the blanks as an artist. But I tried to develop a system in the infotech environment, in the machine learning environment, that starts to try to mimic evolution. So, you know, have different ways of reforming and natural, like different kinds of selection, mutation, variation, to make these hypothetical evolutions. And so this is something that we can say we can go back in time or forward in time with. And, you know, there's questions that come up in that too, of like, where are we rewriting history and where are we trying to paint that picture in our own minds too, of what we already know and what we already have. So it's kind of this play back and forth between me making hypothetical evolutions, but then actually looking at what we know about evolution and saying, where are we making these leaps and thinking that we know? But it's maybe just as much as I have fabricated that our actual theories have fabricated as well.
When we were talking about this a couple weeks ago, Mickey and I went to see this film on de-evolution about Stuart Brand. This is like becoming a serious branch of thinking, and your work is considering the same stuff. So that's another connection point that we should bring on the show here.
Yeah, we should find out. We should get Stuart on the show at some point, or the filmmakers. The film was called "We Are as Gods," I think, or something. And the point was, he actually put that in the old Whole Earth catalog back in the 70s, and it was about cool tools, right? And he is now working with George Church on merging elephant DNA with woolly mammoth DNA to repopulate the tundra of the Siberian tundra area, because they believe that if you could recreate that structure, it tamps down and actually reduces so much of the carbon emissions coming out of the methane that is coming from the heating up ice there, and they are able to prove that that would actually reverse climate change. Now, huge ethical problems and challenges with this, and in fact, part of the documentary was about Stuart Brand's life, but it was a fascinating glimpse into some of the very passionate debates going on around this topic, around de-evolution, re-evolution. You know, are we as gods? Because the point of that comment was, "We are as gods, we might as well get good at it." Was the original, I think, quote. And I'm not sure we're ready for that.
Well, I
Amy,
think
what were you going to say?
I was going to say it's really interesting, though, that like this is this time where it's the questioning, what is real, what is not real. In fact, I had a very educated collector reach out to me or just like made a comment, you know, when I posted this work, when I shared it online, that's like, that isn't real. And I'm like, actually it is. Look at this like article in Nature magazine, look at science. Like, I know
real.
Right? It's like, it's hard to believe that these things are real. And then it questions if, you know, should we make them real? Like if they're that unbelievable, like if we could really do Frankenstein, should we? I don't.
Well, the should versus could, I think, is becoming more and more of a conversation, hopefully, as a society. Peter, you said this was going to be an investigation into reality, and what is reality? How have we done? Like you're the ace reporter on the beat here.
Yeah,
where do you come? Where do you wrap up to? Where do you come around to in terms of
I'd
this?
like to actually wrap up.
Let's turn to Professor Claudia for this.
Yeah, because it's been interesting for me to hear this. I want to make a comment, which is that my first show that I made at the Pat Hearn Gallery 30 plus years ago, perhaps more, 35, I turned myself into Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and then I transformed myself. And we were called intermedia artists at that point. And I set myself up, and I had psychological tests done of myself, and I used Super 8 movies and paintings and sculptures, and it was environmental the way I do now. And the next show after that I did with Gallery Ropach in Paris, I turned myself into Lord Byron. So I basically have always set myself up in a very adversarial way to logocentrism. So here I am again. Like, I actually feel that what I'm doing is very the opposite of all of these discussions, right? I certainly read a lot, but I am not visualizing, and I absolutely resist visualizing information. And the other thing is, and so I would like to close when it's time to go off, is just to play the little snippet of the piece that I made 10 years ago, also with my students, which is horrifying and sad and brutal or whatever, because I think I feel that I identified so much with mixed reality, with the way things have turned out in terms of representation, because I identified with that fluidity, which came to be through mixed reality as the dominant form of representation right now. So I feel that art is an enactment of consciousness, and that's when it gets meaningful for me. And so there's a performative element to it too. So Amy, for me, like, you are enacting your beliefs, your strong desire that you can make everything okay and live forever and fix your head and bring your mother back to life. And you're enacting it through these actions. And of course, I don't know if you can fix your head. I don't know enough about but I also have a chronic disease, and I happen to know it's not fixable, right? I just can treat it. I can just, keep it from getting worse. So I feel like that is sort of the liminal space, which is the mixed reality of data, which goes into creating, right, a thing. And then we pretend that we have now mastered it, and that makes us feel a little better. But the actual reality, I want to go, I pasted in there the Atlantis and the digital city. The reality of the digital city is that the way our consciousness now works as liminal beings who live in a fluid space that is mixed is, let's see, right? We don't know. And I think that it's like, and living with that not knowingness is why you have all these truth problems right now. Like someone like Trump is exploiting that. And I see younger people.
Ambiguity and fluidity and those are all uncomfortable for everybody, right? Just the idea, the ambiguous, people call it the VUCA future, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, etc. And I think that's just part of the human condition too. I love your comment about art is an enactment of reality. So that might be one of the threads about how we end this investigation is, what is reality? Amy, do you have any thoughts on what is reality?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's the truth.
Reality for me is like,
Preach.
is that like famous, John Lennon, life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans. All this, we keep ourselves busy with all of this stuff. But the reality is what's happening that we're participating in, that we don't really have the option to have that overview to see.
Yeah, I totally agree. Technology is what keeps me busy. Otherwise I'll fall into the abyss. And I can keep like trying to figure out, how do you do that? Or how did you do that? But in the end, yeah.
And I feel like personally I thrive in that area of the not knowing. Like I embrace that not knowing. That's an exciting precipice.
Right. You've
But it's
identified,
uncomfortable, but you want to embrace it.
This is probably one of the great cultural divides, right? The comfort with ambiguity and what comes next. Also, you have a sense of agency, right? As an artist, you're playing with these things and you understand you can make them. If you feel like you're on the receiving end or a victim of it, you don't like it. And if you don't understand what's going on and you don't understand your role or your identity, accentuated by the end of work and other changes, creates even more identity or more anxiety. One of the things I take away from this is McLuhan made the point that artists are great early warning indicators. They're perceivers, and they also perceive field versus ground. He talked about art as an anti-environment, which is an indispensable means of perception, and therefore empowers artists to see the imperceptible, which was another way of saying they kind of see what's going on first. They perceive their world. And Claudia, in many ways, you're a great example of an early warning indicator because you fell into this space at its birth and rather early on saw how it was kind of antipodal from photography and materialism and therefore the Enlightenment because you had studied that, right? So in a way, you were perfectly crafted to kind of get this, and you've been tenaciously dealing with it and its ramifications and perhaps its sad ramifications. Amy kind of represents perhaps this other postmodern world of no problem with ambiguity and playing with it and believing what's possible. And in a way, you're representing these two different or a couple of different views of the whole thing, but both of which kind of start with the fact that there's less of a set reality. We get to set it.
Well, I think art is also about reception. So the art part comes when there's an audience. And although I might be good at doing Maya and Unity, I actually cannot control reception at all. And in fact, we have less control because we're not the gatekeepers. And, as that brilliant article you gave me to read pointed out, we are in an overly bureaucratic, overly corporatized, institutionalized world. And in fact, I can do Maya, but I cannot put my work in the modern. It took me 30 years and I got it in the Whitney and I still can't believe it. Right. So, I think the art
idea
part,
of the reception part of it, that it needs an audience. I mean, this is about feedback loops, right? And the strange loops that kind of jump levels from what I thought I was doing to what happened, to what people reacted to what I was doing, to what fed back to what I think I was doing. It's a moving target in some regards. I wonder, Omid, can you pull up the whiteboard? I've, of course, tried to doodle the whole time. So one of these dimensions that we were just talking about was sort of that notion of, on one end, agency, and at the other end, self-doubt, and on one end, the known and the unknown and the ambiguous. And I just found it fascinating. Now, I apologize for my low-res representations of everything, but I was trying to capture kind of the conversation here about what was going on, and I really got fascinated by going back to saying what exactly is reality, and I think one thing that Claudia offered was this liminal space where art is enactment of reality, and you just talked about that it doesn't happen alone. There are the audience, which feeds right back into that, and the reception, and where does it go?
I don't think art is an enactment of reality. It's an enactment of emotions. And I think that's...
Interesting.
I agree with that, yeah.
I try to capture as fast as I can, but I don't always get it right.
So it's an enactment of our consciousness and our emotional state. And so, I keep enacting the same things, whatever my traumas are, over and over. And it's sad, right? And I can't fix it. And, you also are enacting, Amy, right?
100%, totally.
Yeah. And it's performance. It's this performative enactment of the backstory.
And I actually do a lot of performance work.
Yeah, me too. I do theater and experimental.
One of the stories of regenerative reliquary with the hand design was that, you know, I was at a place where I was doing a lot of performance work, and I have to be there then in the museum physically. So how can I like disembody myself? So as a performance artist, I could be many places as one. That's really
well, most of half of my work is experimental theater, dance, and is totally performative. And I like the 3D virtual thing because I can enact performance within it with puppets.
So I'd like to loop back to a little bit of history. Amy, can we zoom in, or Omid, can you zoom in on Amy's background a little bit, or can we? What's behind you, Amy? What's that big patch bay and all that other stuff over to the side?
This is a Sandine image processor.
Oh, wow.
What is a Sandine image processor?
Where are you?
This is my studio in San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
This is a Sandine image processor, which is a historically significant image processor. So basically it takes image and sound and can modify it in real time, like authentically in real time. This is analog. What's also interesting about this this piece is it was, I think, one of the first open source, if not the first open source piece of technology, because they, Dan Sandine, released the instruction manual so you could make it yourself.
Whoa. You made that?
When I was in school, Dan Sandine was at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and I was at the University of Illinois in Chicago.
He's still there.
I remember that only master's students could go down to his lab, and I was an undergrad. And we wanted to help out when he wanted to premiere something called The Cave at SIGGRAPH, at this big computer graphics show. And so I was like an intern to the intern, helping lay it out in this weird 3D program so that they could actually premiere it. And The Cave was actually kind of what Claudia was just talking about, which was multiple screens and multiple dimensions that you walked inside of instead of virtually, though, but physically. And it did parallax tracking of your head so that you could see it, but it required, 3 or 4 Silicon Graphics monster refrigerators at the time. So this is kind of interesting because what's behind you, Amy, is kind of the beginning of us messing around with reality through analog processing and computing. I just love that because it kind of ties back into
it's closure.
where we started.
It's
and
definitely.
you might know, actually, this was Bob Snyder's machine. Do you know him? He's a sound artist in Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, I know all of them because I got put in a book with, I don't know what I was doing. Most of the time, I don't know what I'm doing in any of these contexts, but somehow, because I'm a romantic, right? But I'm in a book, which is with that older generation, in which they were all, the Dan Sandine was part of it. And they were all around the University of Illinois. And so I do.
Now, I use this now to mostly connect to my biosignals and my biofeedback. I also have a float tank here, a sensory chamber. So that generation is like, I get a lot of affirmation from them that like I am still in their thought stream and like using their machine wisely moving forward. So
that's great. I love it.
Wait, you've got a float tank. What the heck is a float tank?
A sensory deprivation chamber is it's about the size of a small car, and you get into this tank. It's filled with about a foot of salinated water that you can completely float on. It's a body temperature. You can't hear anything. You can't see anything. So it takes away all your senses. And you float there and you feel like you're floating just through the universe. Honestly, it takes off all the.
You just gave me a total flashback to Altered States. Did everybody watch that movie? That was like a big seminal movie because Amy is creating Altered States.
Well, that was Altered States. They were floating, weren't they?
Well, and it's interesting when we're talking about reality, being in the sensory deprivation chamber, completely out of reality, is like where I feel like I can experience reality the most. Like I just kind of go out. I go out of my body and I more feel it. I feel it in my body. I come back and I'm really just revitalized and I feel peaceful in the world when I come out.
All right, I like how this wrapped all the way back to Altered States. Um, I think we should wrap up. We lost Peter's video. Peter, are you
Oh
still
my
there?
God, where's my video? Hold it a second. Can we hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
How about that?
Yes.
Well, clearly I've become
you're
And-
disembodied. Yes.
and this is where I will end up, because I believe as an immaterial person, I perhaps
Wow, you're just like a pulsing
Yeah,
circle when you talk, Peter. Is
yeah,
this reality? Is that what you really are?
I'm
Yes,
into
hello?
it.
Can we
Yeah, you're there, Peter. We can
still
hear
hear?
you.
Okay, how about that? Okay,
It's your turn. It's your turn to wrap up the show. I
So
think
let
we
me
all gotta.
Yeah, I want to wrap
Go.
up. Mickey, first of all, I want to congratulate you because you drew a four-space matrix as you took us from to anxiety or not, or certainty or not, and that, of course, is the BCG matrix. And
That's what I have to
with
do.
BCG.
Can we see it
So I
again while
wanted
we're
to
talking?
thank- Huh? I wanted to thank you for deploying a BCG matrix. Secondly, another
Yes.
interesting question here really is about what we control. I referenced the Danny Hillis article, which pointed out that as we moved into the Enlightenment and we learned about science and we built technology, we felt we could control things more. And then suddenly we get to this point, as Amy pointed out at the very beginning, we're a little bit concerned about controlling nature. That's a kind of a brittle thing. We know we can't control nature, but we know we've granted ourselves enormous ability to control things. So some of this really has to do with, well, now that we can create anything, exactly what do we have control or agency over, and can we write our future? And Agnieszka Pilat wrote in a note here, which, by the way, she's firmly rooted in the Gropius industrial heroic school, which says if obstacles become the way, is it possible that climate change and all the crises now create the possibility frontier that we might resolve, right? Which is kind of a optimistic view of this or control of it. But I think that's one of the other questions that's located in all of this. What do we control, particularly when we can make things up? So I'm just wondering if you guys have any final thoughts on that before we wrap up and return to the present day.
I definitely think it's an opportunity. Are we going to embrace that opportunity is the question.
I feel like my job is just to do the best I can with the people that I work with. And I mean, basically I'm a pedagogue, and like my social practice is them. And like, I feel like I can reinvent the world through opening them up. And I don't think that's the best I can do. It's a microcosm. It has to do with people. So
are your students your experimental medium?
Excuse me, are my students what?
Your experimental medium.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have actually invented many pedagogic, that's my thing, is I made, I have, my program is a different structure from teaching. I ripped it out of the industry pipeline system. And now I'm going to build I want to build a hubs school in which the students build it as I teach it, and they, they live it and build it and live in it and learn it. So, yeah.
So you're using cell cultures just like Amy. It's just that the cell cultures have matured to the point where there are about 50 trillion of those cells, and they're called like Bob or Susan or something like that.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I have 50 trillion, but I have trouble remembering. Yeah. I have a lot. It's hard to remember their name. Yeah, right. I have a lot.
Yeah.
But
Mickey,
Peter, take us out.
In these weeks before the election, arguably in these weeks before we arrive at the future abruptly, or whenever that process starts, we're really spending some time trying to get ahead of things, understanding kind of the world that we're creating. That's clearly what this show is about. We have three more shows coming up on this. One with Timoni, who runs a lot of the digital twin effort at Unity, and with also the guy who runs digital twinning for the United Kingdom. So we're going to look at these powerful technologies that purport to simulate or crash test dummy the future and how we apply them. And then we're going to speak with the head of AI also at Unity, who suggests that when you add machine learning to simulation, that grants you a number of powers. And then we're going to go back and do a show on ancient multimedia. Ancient
Wow.
multimedia.
We're gonna
You
try to
and I
get
both-
we're gonna try to get
Go ahead.
some early computers up and running,
Yeah.
and on the internet. I think mine just showed up today, actually. So I'm ready for it. I'm unearthing
mine
it
is
now,
about
but that's coming up.
Make a comeback.
I know. And we're also going to be tuning in someone from Europe who experienced both the American world of the Homebrew Computer Club when he was a kid, all the way through to what he's doing now, rebooting old video games and things. And I think we're going to have maybe Catherine Gale on, who wrote a book called The Politics Industry that actually looks at what if we were to actually refactor the political industrial complex so that citizens were actually customers instead of special interests. And she's done a fascinating kind of analysis of just some simple changes that are actually fairly cost effective that would force the political industrial industry to actually treat citizens like some of the constituents,
Like
instead of
consumers.
just special interests.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask you,
Anyway,
what's the name? What's the book? What can you chat the
It's
book
called
in?
the Politics Industry. I wonder if I've got it around here somewhere, but yeah, that's coming up as well.
Okay.
Catherine Gale, amazing reevaluation of what would happen if we did some very simple fixes.
Sounds great.
Peter,
By the
will
way-
this quarantine ever end, do you think? This
No.
reality that we're living with.
I'm just gonna drop out. All right.
Yeah.
I'm-
Thank you. Okay, well, first of all, let's thank you both very much.
Thank
We
you
will
for having
continue this conversation, and then Mick, you and I
Thank
can wrap
you,
it up.
Amy.
Claudia, thank you.
Thank you, Claudia.
Amy, thank you so much.
Claudia,
It's a
My
pleasure
pleasure.
meeting. Yeah.
I think we could talk for a few more hours. It was great.
Yeah.
We-
Thank you.
And
All
let me
right.
just wrap up by pointing out a point that Claudia mentioned when we were reading that article, or looked at that article on anxiety about institutions. The Catherine Gale's book is really about reforming our institutions. And if we go back to the Danny Hillis piece, he pointed out that as our technology and institutional creations have become more complex, our relationship to them has changed, and we now relate to them like we once related to nature. Instead of being their masters, we have learned to bargain with them, cajole them, and guiding him in a general direction of our goals. We have built our jungle, and it has a life of its own. And then he points out that the final portion of the end of the Enlightenment is building machines that learn and surpass us. So to simply answer the question, will this quarantine end? No, quarantine turns out to be the flip side of entanglement, which is only beginning. At the very beginning of all of this moment.
It's full
And with
circle.
that,
What time is it in quarantine?
it is
There-
now
it's
5:56 Pacific quarantine, Mickey. So
All
I want to
right,
thank
that-
I
you
say
all.
we
That's great. I love that
We'll
ending.
see
That
you
was
on Wednesday.
closure.
Take care.
That was
Bye-bye.
great. Bye-bye.
bye everybody.
Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine.